Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Webequie Supply Road live streaming sessions. This is another in our series of live streaming sessions on what we call study plans, which are essentially work plans. And study plans are required as part of the federal impact assessment process. So the purpose of this series of study plans is to take community members and the general public through these plans, just so you get an idea of what we're doing as part of the environmental assessment. And today we're going to go through 4 different study plans. And with me, without further ado, is my special guest co-host for this week, Ange Brooks. Ange, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Don. Happy to be here.
Ange is a senior ecologist and manager with S&C Lavalin, and she's stepping into Mike's shoes this week, filling in for him. And so she and I will do a little back and forth on these different study plans, and we got a lot to cover,
We
don't
do.
we?
Action-packed.
Action-packed. That's exactly it. Yeah, that's action, I guess. Yeah, that's definitely action. So, maybe what we'll do is start off with one that sort of has 3 different subjects within it. It's geology, terrain, and soils. This is there's a lot of activities here that are done for a lot of different purposes, for engineering purposes, for environmental purposes. There's a lot going on in this study plan. So maybe, Ange, you can walk us through this a bit.
Sure.
Just to give our viewers a bit of an understanding of what's involved.
Okay, so the geology, terrain, and soil study plan encompasses a lot of information. It describes the geology locally as well as regionally, geological hazards, the chemistry of the rock and the aggregates, the potential for contamination of soil or sediments, and then it also will describe the soil layers and the depths and the rock.
So, Ange, when we're talking about geology, we're basically, in this case, talking about the subsurface, right?
Yep.
So the rock and the soil that makes up what's underground the project area, essentially,
Exactly.
right? However we define that. And so what we're trying to do is get a better understanding of what that's like, so we can understand how the subsurface will behave when a project like the Supply Road, if it were put into place, how would the environment, the geological environment, respond, really, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where we're going with this in terms of this study plan. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of activities associated with this. When we talk about geological hazards, it could mean a lot of things, right? It could be susceptibility to earthquakes, I suppose, things like that. But
Yeah.
it doesn't apply in this
Not in
area.
this case.
But it's probably more about erosion, I think, isn't it?
It is. In this case, I'd say they're more, because this area is the James Bay lowlands, and it's basically one gigantic wetland, if you will. We're looking at a vast area of peatlands.
Yes.
And it's that type of terrain that isn't ideally suited to a road.
Yeah.
So the geology, terrain, and soils study plan is outlining the work that's required to gather the information that's needed.
To figure out
Right,
how
to
to build
figure
the
out how to
road.
build that, yeah, and the best way to route the road based on the terrain.
Because it's all about trying to, to do projects like this, but limit the impacts as much as possible, whether
Yes.
it's to water, whether it's to soil. You don't want to impact water levels, cause flooding on one side of the road, and there's a lot to it, right? So
Absolutely.
this study plan really is focused on looking at things like that. You did mention something as well too about determining the chemistry of the construction materials. When you build projects like this, you need to get your construction materials that make up the road base locally, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Oh yeah,
it's not
it's
feasible.
too expensive. Exactly.
So when you think about that, for example, some types of rock will, when exposed to water, cause acid to leach out of them and potentially cause environmental damage.
Correct,
So
yeah.
part of this work, Ange, it's about basically getting rock samples and testing them for to what degree they do that. They leach or release acid, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the big activities associated with this work. That's mainly done, I think, more on the engineering side, right? That's by
It
the
is, yes.
engineering
It's
team.
exactly done by the engineering team.
And the engineering team also they'll drill holes, what we call boreholes, where the crossing structures are planned to be. So when the water body crossing structures, whether it's a lake or a river or a creek, they'll drill these boreholes, and when they do that, they're getting a picture of
The subsurface,
layers,
exactly.
The subsurface, yeah. So
Yeah.
if our team can I think we've got the geology TerrainSoil study plan up. You'll see on the screen, you'll see a drill rig, which is drilling one of those boreholes. And then what it does as part of this work is it creates a profile. As it drills down, it creates what you call a core sample, which gives you shows you the different layers of the soils and rock that are underneath the area where you're drilling. So this is important work for a lot of different reasons, not only just to understand the soils, but to understand the properties of the soils so that you can get a general understanding of how the bridge might be designed, right? Which helps you in costing, the bridge as well, identifying special materials that might be required as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, now one activity I think that we don't really have to deal with, unfortunately, in this project is determining potential for contaminate. Well, it's not determining contaminated sites. It's more, I guess, determining the potential for contamination of. So understanding the soils that are in the area.
Yes.
And just so you know what the sensitivity is, I guess.
Exactly, because we're dealing with a very sensitive environment.
Yes.
So yes, we need to know the areas that, not that one area is more sensitive than the other, but this also goes in with the groundwater and surface water, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But it's identifying the pathways of how contaminants could travel once the road is actually built and during construction.
Yes.
Also, of course.
Yeah, so it's really important work. It's difficult work. It has to be done mainly in the winter. Right, Ange? Because it's very difficult to do in areas that are as dominated by water as this area is. Winter, when everything's frozen up, is probably the best time to do this kind of work, isn't it?
Absolutely. Winter is best in frozen conditions, so when they're laying down the pad for the drill rig, they don't have to worry about finding higher ground or drier ground. They can just lay it down in an open area where they have to cut the fewest amount of trees or shrubs to be able to place that drill rig.
I guess I should say it's the best time of year to be doing the work, as long as you're not the person doing it.
I was going to say, it's not so nice for the people out in the field.
Yeah, that's right.
It's really cold. Yeah, it's shorter daylight hours. But the bonus is they don't have bugs to deal with. So I don't know. The two things, I take the cold.
Minus 40, bugs. Your choice.
Cold
right? Pick
for
your
me.
poison.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's a really important plan. There's a lot of information gained from it. Understanding the different types of soil, the layers of soil, underground and rock underground. Very, very important. Understand the properties of that soil, so you can better design bridges or get a better idea of what kind of bridge design might be required. Lots of different pieces of information can be gathered as well. And I think part of that work, we'll get onto that with the next study plan. I'm probably jumping a little too far ahead here. So let's move on to a study plan that's one that you're intimately involved with, and that's the aquatic habitat study plan. Maybe you can take us through this plan, Ange, because it's pretty big.
It is. This is a really, no, it's an important one. They're all important, but this is one of the ones that I worked on. So included with the aquatic habitat study plan are methods of how we conducted the fish habitat assessments, the fish community studies, the benthic invertebrate surveys, the fish spawning surveys. What else did we do? So that information, that all of those surveys that we were conducted was to determine what fish species we had in the area, the habitat that's available, any spawning patterns if we have. We didn't really get a lot of information about that, but
No.
a little bit. Species sensitivity, and then of course the benthic invertebrate community. And I should note that all of these studies were conducted at the, as close as we could possibly get to the proposed watercourse crossings. And we were planning to do approximately 26 locations.
And so and the reason why you do that is because those are the areas that are probably going to be most affected, at
Yeah.
least on a temporary basis.
Exactly.
Right, by the construction, because a structure will be built across the watercourse, right? So that's the thinking
Yep.
behind that.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take a look at some of these things. When you do a fish habitat assessment, you're making observations, right? So you're looking upstream, you're looking downstream. Can you tell us a bit about what's involved in those assessments?
Sure. So we followed the Ontario Stream Assessment Protocol when we were doing the fish community, the fish habitat assessment. So following that protocol, you usually do 50 meters upstream to 200 meters downstream of the actual crossing footprint. So however wide that footprint is, add on the extra 50 and 200 meters. In some cases, we weren't able to do all of that because of accessibility, and some of these streams, the substrate isn't exactly solid and it's impossible to walk in, so we kind of only did a snapshot assessment at the actual location. And then in those cases, we also did a little aerial survey.
Okay.
Not air photos, but we took photos from the air.
Now, do you do measurements?
We do, yes.
Okay.
So we do all the standard measurements. We do water depth, width of the water course, the height of the stream banks, if there are stream banks, because some don't really have super defined stream banks. We did water flow measurements.
Oh, really? Okay.
Water temperatures, dissolved oxygen, pH, conductivity.
Okay.
Yeah, all of those in situ measurements with that YSI meter.
So you're getting like a snapshot of the conditions at that location.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
And then you're doing these which times of year again?
We do them in the summer during base flow conditions. So you don't want to do them in the spring when the water is at its highest point. And the same thing in the fall, the water levels get a little bit higher again because you tend to get more rainfall. So summer is ideal. Also, the weather is a little bit more cooperative. The bugs are bad, but you're getting a better snapshot of what the fish habitat is like at that point in time.
And that's what, we keep talking about this, but, environmental assessments, we talk about establishing that baseline, right? Describing those existing conditions. And this is a perfect example of that, right? Trying to understand the conditions, the aquatic habitat conditions at these crossing locations, which are going to be most impacted, if at all, at different times of year, right? So now let's, you do some fish, what you call fish community sampling. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. We did fish community sampling at each location as we could, as we were able to access. We used a combination of methods, gill netting, minnow trapping, angling, and just visual surveys as well. The method that was used depended on the size of the watercourse and the water flow, that type of thing.
Okay.
Right, for these open fen watercourses, they were easy to place those minnow traps.
Oh,
And we had
okay.
bigger ones and smaller ones, and so we got a variety of
Do you catch a lot of
sizes and
fish in
species.
those areas?
Yeah, we do catch a lot of
Really?
fish. Yep.
Okay. So what species of fish would occur in those kinds of areas?
In those smaller water courses, we got more of the, what we would consider forage species, the minnows,
Okay.
shiners, that type of thing.
Okay.
But we did get a lot of walleye, and we did get some pike, depending if we targeted
Yeah.
areas that we thought was pike habitat. Lots of suckers.
Okay.
We did get the odd brook trout here and there, but not as many as I thought that we would get.
Okay. Now let's shift to something that I know Mike likes to talk about. He just likes this topic. He really enjoys this topic. It's benthic invertebrates. Maybe you can explain to our viewers a bit about benthic invertebrates. First of all, what they are.
Yeah. Okay. So benthic invertebrates are essentially bugs that live in the sediment of a stream or a lake or a river or whatever water body. They are.
How big are they, Ange? Just out of curiosity.
Okay. So some of them can be tiny little worms. Some of them can be bigger. I mean, I don't think they got them here, but down in southern Ontario, you get these big giant ones called hellgrammites that actually bite.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You get water scorpions. They will give you a good sting.
Okay.
Yeah, there's crayfish, of course, will pinch you.
Oh, they'd be a benthic invertebrate, I guess, too. Would they?
They're an invertebrate, but they're not benthos.
Oh,
But
okay.
I mean, you get them anyway. And then if
Yes.
you're sticking your hand in that water, you'd be like, so many times, oh yeah, I've gotten
So,
clipped.
which species, do all species feed off these? Would you say?
Yeah, I would say most fish species are at some point in their life cycle eating benthic invertebrates.
Okay.
And they all vary on what they're looking for.
Which is, I guess, why they're such a good, one of the reasons why they're such a good indicator, I guess.
Yes, yeah, so that is. They are an indicator of the overall health of the system. Depending on what the system is like and whether or not, the water is flowing really well, and that you get species, what we call the EPT, so Femoptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. So it's like caddisfly,
Words of the day.
mayfly, and stonefly. Those are your ones that are indicating your best. You'll find those in trout streams, for example.
Really? Okay.
But in these, in the slower flowing open fens, you're probably mostly going to get your worms, like your oligochaetes and chironomids, and snails and
Okay, yeah, interesting.
stuff like that.
Michael, Michael, enjoy this video. I think afterwards, he's going to learn a lot from this, don't you think? I think he'll.
I
learn
think
a lot.
so.
Yeah, we've dived
words.
far deeper than we ever have with him into benthic invertebrates, but this is for him. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the fish spawning surveys.
Sure. So we did some the first season that we were out doing field work. We used these metal frame contraptions that are called artificial egg mats. They're essentially just rectangular metal frames, and they're wrapped with furnace filter. And we attached 3 of the frames together to form a gang and place those in areas downstream of where we figured that walleye or lake sturgeon or suckers would be spawning.
Okay.
Because I'll just use walleye as an example. They are broadcast spawners, so they don't dig a nest like the salmonids do, and so the female lays the eggs, and then they're just kind of bouncing around in the water column, and then eventually drop to the bottom, and they're sticky, and they stick to the substrate, and our egg mats on that furnace filter, and that is what, when we pull those up, you can see the eggs.
Okay, yeah. And so those eggs that were collected, they were sent off to a lab, were they?
They were sent off, to the University of Guelph.
Okay, and then they get identified
Exactly,
to confirm which species
Yep.
they are? Okay.
I think they do a DNA analysis on those eggs, and that's
Oh,
how they
really?
determine. Yeah, because it's really hard to determine species just by simply looking at a fish egg.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's well, that's pretty interesting. There's a lot. There's a lot there in the aquatic habitat study plan. That's for sure. Why don't we move on now to groundwater, the groundwater study, so if our team can shift the slide over to the groundwater study. This is, again, another important piece of work here. Water is so critical to community members because all their sustenance comes from the water and the land, but water is just everything. Is everything to the community members, and groundwater, or spring water as it's often called, is very, very important. And so, as part of the environmental assessment and impact assessment, we spend a lot of effort looking at groundwater. And so for this project, we have installed, I believe, 10 wells, I think, in a number of locations, both along the road and off the road in the areas that we have identified as being sources of rock, whether it's aggregate or sites for quarries. And so these wells have been installed. They're often done, as you and I talked about earlier today, at the same time as you're doing a borehole, right? Because you're drilling the hole, you're getting the sample to identify the layers of soil and rock that are in that hole, and then you might install a well.
Yeah, because you don't want to drill twice.
No, you don't want to drill twice.
Yeah.
You want to get in and have as limited an impact as possible. So they'll install a well, and it usually has like a metal sort of casing over on the surface anyway, usually with a lid and a lock on it, and those are access to get samples from. Quite often, and I know at least for a few of our boreholes in the muskeg areas, we're putting in what you call piezometers, which measure groundwater depth, which is important to understand how the groundwater changes in level from season to season, right?
Yes.
So not only are we looking at changes in level, but we also, when we take samples, we're looking at the quality of the water, right? So the chemical composition of the groundwater. And then you mentioned earlier today about how typically you'll take the surface samples close to where the wells are. Do you want to explain maybe why that's done?
Yeah, while they're doing the groundwater sampling, they go and they take a surface water sample as close as possible to where the groundwater well is located, usually within a few hundred meters. And that is to understand the groundwater surface water interaction, because it's all interconnected.
Yes.
And in order to understand how the entire system is working, you need to know how the groundwater is flowing and how it's affected by surface water, and surface water is affected by groundwater, and
there's a lot of interaction between the two.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on groundwater or surface water, but I know they're all interconnected. And
you just play a groundwater expert on television.
That's right.
Yes, yes. Well, I know what you mean, yeah. So one of the other measurements that we do when we do these wells is we look at hydraulic conductivity, right? Which is sort of an indicator of how easily water moves through the subsurface, through soil and rock too. Because, if we have a better idea, you get an idea of what you call permeability, right? How permeable, how easily fluids can move through the soil, the subsurface. So there's a lot of effort put into this, and it's difficult, challenging work in remote areas because you're moving a lot of equipment in by helicopter, and it's time-consuming.
It's crazy.
It's pretty tough work. So there's a lot involved in that, but it's an important program. It's a really good program, and so we'll be reporting back as time goes on the results of that work. Let's move on now to our final study plan, which is, funny enough, surface water. How about that? So maybe, Ange, you can tell us a bit about the surface water study plan and what's involved in that.
Okay, so the surface water program, water samples are collected from about 26 water crossings, pretty much matching where we did the fish habitat assessments. So at all or as many as we could access to the road crossings.
Yeah.
We collect these samples to analyze the water quality, and the results are compared to the federal and the provincial water quality objectives. We do the sampling at 3 different times of the year, spring, summer, and fall, and that's just to get a better idea of how everything is working throughout the year. Obviously, we don't do it in the winter. Everything's under frozen conditions. The water samples are tested for a variety of chemical parameters like metals, nutrients, organic compounds, but we're also testing for acidity, so the pH, and we do real-time turbidity monitoring, and
so that's like the cloudiness of
kind
the
of,
water?
yeah, like the total suspended solids. That's they're sort of connected. So turbidity and TSS.
Together, they're an indicator of
so
the clarity of the
TSS.
water.
TSS is measured in the lab, and we do turbidity like at the time of the sample. They're
That's what that YSI.
Well, the YSI just does the DO, the pH, the temperature, the conductivity, but we actually have an actual turbidity meter.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, you collect a little vial and you put it in, and then it sends a beam of light through and tells you
reading.
the NTU, which I can't remember what that acronym
either.
stands for.
Something units.
Yeah.
How about that? Narrowed it down.
Very smart.
Well, I try. Okay, so you're taking it at different times a year. Why are you taking the samples at different times a year?
Because the water levels vary at different times of the year. So obviously in spring, we take the samples as close as possible to snow melt. The water levels are crazy high in the spring, and in the summer, they're taken during baseflow conditions, so when the water levels are at their lowest.
Okay.
And then in the fall, we take them again because typically there's more precipitation in the fall, so there's more mixing, if you will, between the groundwater and surface water, and it changes up things. So it's important to get a seasonal perspective on the whole system.
And as you were talking about, you do like tests for the physical attributes of water, right, on the spot. So you look at that. So you mentioned pH, which is basically a measurement of acidity of the water, right? So in the Webequie region, there's there can be quite a big difference in acidity of the water. Why is that exactly, Ange?
Why is there? Well, the whole of James Bay lowlands is one big peatland, right? I mentioned earlier that it's one big giant wetland, and a lot of it is peatlands. And within those areas where there's a higher concentration of peat, it's more acidic. So the water in those watercourses, you're going to find that the DO is a little bit lower. And that could affect the fish community.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So in a few of the watercourses, we found there was little to no fish community, and sure enough, when you do a measurement of the pH, you find that the pH is much lower than, let's say, Winnisk Lake or the Mookatai River, for example.
So some fish species just cannot live.
You can't live in that
kind of an environment,
right?
Yeah. And that's interesting. Like there's a lot to this work.
There is,
There's quite a bit to it.
Like from the surface you think, oh, there's not really much to it, but when you sort of try to unpack all of the information that was collected, it's amazing what you can, when you put it all together into your baseline study and you start to figure out how things are working, it's really interesting.
It paints a real picture,
it does,
doesn't it? Because you're looking at water quality, you're looking at spawning patterns, if you're able to get that, you're looking at which species are in which locations, you're looking at how many of those of each species are in those locations, so the composition of the environment, you're looking at the physical characteristics of these crossing locations.
Exactly.
There's a lot to it. So, wow, that was a lot to cover, wasn't it, in a short period of time? Well, before we close up for today, I just want to tell everyone that we have one more of these streaming sessions on the study plans coming up on November 23rd.
I thought I saw November 24th.
That's in community on November 24th.
Oh, I see. Okay.
We're a day earlier.
My mistake.
Yes, we're a day earlier. So in 2 weeks, on this very same channel, we're going to be talking about caribou and wolverine study plans wildlife and wildlife habitat, species at risk, and breeding birds study plan. So again, lots to talk about. We're going to try and get lots of pictures and maybe some videos if we can, whatever we can dig up from our archives. And so there's a lot to talk about again in 2 weeks. And I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us again, and welcome you to join us again next week. We have a radio show, or not next week, 2 weeks from today. We have a radio show at 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. on Wawate Radio, which I think we stream on our website, supplyroad.ca. And then later in the afternoon at 4 p.m., like today, we have a streaming session as well. And so don't forget to visit our website at supplyroad.ca. There's lots of information there. There's lots of ways you can contact us if you have questions or comments about the project. Feel free to send them to us. We're happy to talk to you at any time. And so we will see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Ange, for pinch hitting there for Mike. You made Mike proud, I think. So we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks.
Bye.